Good. Okay, so we will get to work. Good morning, everyone. Good morning, and we continue considering the incredible Jewish leader, Gadol, that was Rav Kook. I wanted to do two pieces of tidying up from our last session. Piece number one is finishing. I rushed through the last years of his life because we ran out of time last week, and 2 weeks ago, and naively, I decided to try and just finish his life in one session, but it proved too difficult, and I want to revisit the last years of his life, which in many ways were the most interesting and troubling years of his career. The second point I wanted to mention, which perhaps I underplayed, and I'll start with the second point, is I spoke a lot about his originality, and we will do that because we're looking at him as a great thinker and an original thinker, and by definition, therefore, some of the ideas I will share will be his more original insights, the out of the box ideas that he said that were unique and different to those ideas that almost everyone else was saying. Perhaps, therefore, as a result, I underplayed in the previous session, and in a way also will in future sessions, because we're looking at that which is original and unique and different about him, the degree to which he's also a classic Gadol. So I spoke about him having this, he writes explicitly about this sense that with the return to Israel, it's time for prophecy to be renewed, and he's a thinker who's difficult to understand because he's happy to talk in the language of medrash and allegory and metaphor. He's a mystic. He's talking about abstract ideals relying on intuition, and it's easier to understand a thinker who's a very precise philosopher who's defining every term and speaking with mathematical clarity, or to understand a thinker who's a very precise halachist and London, who's again sort of scientifically using the language of halachic science and very precisely formulating their arguments. When you've got a thinker who explicitly is saying, I'm a mystic, I'm using intuition, I'm trying to enter you into a sort of altered state of consciousness almost, an awareness, it's much harder to tie them down and sort of grab onto what they're saying, particularly if you're not immersed in their Beit HaMedrash. To understand them, you have to sort of be immersed into their way of thinking, and it's much harder for an outsider to deal and grapple with what they're saying. And I emphasized this last week, but maybe what I should have also emphasized, though, is he was a phenomenal classic Jewish thinker also. In other words, he was a world-class posek and halachist and London. And I didn't speak about that side of it because I was sort of talking about that which is original, but I was asked about it afterwards, and I wanted to emphasize that. We have witnesses, reports of his years in Volozhin, in which he was sort of 17 hours a day of learning, 7 hours a day of learning. He was an incredibly important posek in many areas of halacha, including in the renewed halachas of agriculture that became applicable as Jews once became farmers in Eretz Israel. There are really two poskim who renewed, two very different poskim who renewed the engagement with the halachas of agriculture, and both poskim are respected by all sides in this area, but have differing impacts on the two worlds, and those are Rav Kook and the Chazon Ish in Bnei Brak. And some of the running debates to this day, most famously, but there's many others around the Heter Mechira in Shemitah, are linked to those two pillars of psak, of the new agricultural laws. I'm not going to discuss in this session, maybe we can do another series on the Chazon Ish, but for now we're talking about Rav Kook, and just to emphasize, he was a classic posek. When he's in posek mode, he's not relying on his intuition, his spiritual intuitions and his mystical insights. He's behaving as a classic posek, and you learn his works, and he sounds like any other posek, using very tightly formulated and carefully reasoned arguments. And in that sense, he can be learned and considered as any other posek. And no one really argues that he's a world-class posek and Gadol in that area. So that's just correcting sort of one imbalance maybe that emerged from the previous session. What I want to now do is, as I said, just go through with a little bit more detail his final years in Eretz Israel. So the year is 1918. He's stranded as we discussed in Chutz La'aretz in England, he's the Rav of the Matzike Adas Shul. He's already lived for time in Eretz Israel in Yafa as the chief rabbi of Yafa. The war is over, and it's now time for him to come back to Eretz Israel. I say this with a sort of bittersweet smile. What happens in 1918? Obviously, the Ottoman Empire has fallen apart. The Turks withdraw from occupying Eretz Israel. It's part of the empire, and now it becomes part of the British mandate. And the British mandate government is a much better government than the Turks. We obviously think of the mandate in terms of the of 48 and and for many decades before that, British were by no means perfect occupiers. They specialised in playing off in all over the empire and playing off the native inhabitants of the empire against each other in order to be the middlemen who could sort of keep control. And they did that, causing great damage to Arab-Jewish relationships, of course, culminating in the massacres in Hebron in 29. But they are certainly a much better government than the Turks. And for the first time, it's easier for Jews to acquire land, to set up successful agricultural colonies, to earn a living, to have equal rights under law. And the external pressure eases off. Here comes the bitter part of the bittersweet smile, an exact ratio with external pressures easing off, internal conflicts mount. So whilst there's always been tensions within the Old Yishuv itself, and certain tensions between the Old Yishuv and the New Yishuv, the Old Yishuv being Talmidim of the Baal Shem Tov, the Vilna Gaon, the Hungarians, Talmidim of the Chasam Sofer, who arrive and see their mission of living in Eretz Israel not as society building or state building, but as an outpost, really, in many ways, of East Europe, and they're aware that they can't really earn a living under Turkish rule. They're relying on a chalukah system, a kollel system, in which money is being sent from Chutz La'aretz, living in dire poverty. They see themselves as the ambassadors of the Jewish world, who with great sacrifice are living in what's a really miserable quarter of the world. But they're living in the palace of the king, they're living in Eretz Israel. And the New Yishuv, some of whom are irreligious, some of whom are religious, but are driven by this desire to create a modern society and create a modern settlement. Maybe it won't yet become a state, but certainly they're trying to build a modern society. So there's tensions between them. So these tensions break out in an extreme way. And we're going to see the Rav Kook, who is an idealist and a man of vision and sort of prophetic view, but not necessarily politically astute, not necessarily practical in many respects. He basically, the summary of the last years of his life, so we're talking about till he dies at age 70. So he moves back to Eretz Israel when he's sort of 56, something like that, and has 14 years or so left in the lands of Israel. In that time, he basically upsets everyone. So those on the right think he's too far on the left. Those on the left think he's too far on the right. Those who are very frum think he's not frum enough. Those who are irreligious think he's too frum. And in many ways, his life is frustrated. His success is in a way post his death, because he seeds Talmidim. He has a few close followers. He writes, as we said, he's a prolific writer. His whole life he's writing. I mentioned that last time. He founds a small yeshiva which goes on to become the Merkaz Harav yeshiva and becomes very influential. And his success, sort of in a way, is more as an ideologue and a thinker and a visionary. His success is in triggering creative thought and ideas rather than an actual hands-on structure and institutions, which he doesn't succeed with at all. Even the movement that in some way claims to be closest to him, and perhaps is closest to him, the Mizrahi movement, this I did mention last time, they're also upset with him around the issue of women's suffrage and women voting in they're not elections yet, we're still pre-state, but there's a representative body of Ard who are going to represent Jewish interests to the British, and the British are to a degree going to give them money and resources and so on. And if you cut out 50% of your voters, if the religious bloc loses 50% of its voters, it's going to get less seats on this Vard as opposed to the irreligious. And Rabbi Maimon of the Mizrahi comes to Rav Kook and says, surely we don't have to be like these old Yishuvniks, we can have women vote. And he says, no, I think Al Pi Halacha, women are not allowed to vote. That's not, a king has to be male, not female. This is halachic argument. And Rav Maimon says, I've learned a lesson from this. Leave politics to the politicians and the rabbis, halacha to, the rabbis to the rabbis. And at that point, you have this sort of rupture, which in many ways lingers again to this day as a tension within the Dati Lumi world. They don't have the same clear structure as in the Haredi world between the political parties and the Das Torah, who are the absolute halachic authorities. So Rav Kook doesn't really succeed on any institutional level. And on a personal level, the attacks against him are going to be vicious from everyone. And I just want to summarize some of the highlights, or lowlights of unfortunately, of what's a very difficult 15 odd years for Rav Kook. The war ends at the end of 1918. Middle of 1919, he's invited back to Eretz Yisrael by a coalition of more junior Rabbonim. The Old Yishuv rabbinate sends him a letter, and they tell him we don't to accept two conditions: that you take on no official position, and that you sign the cherem against secular education. The Old Yishuv has a cherem against secular education. A lot of debate as to the origins of this cherem. And obviously I'm not spelling this out, but you can see how these divides feed into so many of the sort of culture camp debates within Orthodoxy today. But they have a ban against education. Is this meant to be a philosophical ban? Do they really not believe in Chol at all? It's a possibility. Jews should be learning Kodesh. Is this a result of a barrier, the boundary, because they feel themselves under siege from the secularists? Is this because the whole schools in the Old Yishuv are largely funded by missionaries and by people who are overtly trying to modernize? So there's French funding coming in through the alliance with a sort of an agenda of Haskalah and modernization. And is this where it's coming from? By the way, Rav Kook is not the only one with whom tensions form. The great Rav Shimshon Fall Hirsch and his community in Germany wants to send money to the Old Yishuv to help them. And they do so by wanting to set up trade schools and craft schools and professional schools to help educate people. And they get condemned by the leaders of the Old Yishuv. So the Old Yishuv sends Rav Kook a message: don't come back unless you're willing to commit to our values. And Rav Kook ignores it. He returns. Don't forget that until now he's sort of avoided a head-on clash with the Old Yishuv because he's been in Jaffa. Jaffa is a little bit of a sort of backwater. He was before the First World War. I'm sorry. He was the Rav in Jaffa, which has an Old Yishuv element to it, but it's also next to the emerging new Yishuv of Tel Aviv, which becomes the most famous of the cities of the new Yishuv. But now Rav Kook is in the heartlands. He's in the Old Yishuv, Old Yerushalayim, and the relationship is tense. Many of his old schoolmates, his old yeshiva mates from Volozhin, are now the leaders of the new Yishuv. And they love Rav Kook. They're friends, but they're also really, really, really bothered by this thinker who they can't really understand what he's saying. He publishes, by the way, his book Orot. And again, what they write about it is very, very, very harsh. But to be fair, it's a completely different sort of sefer to anything that's been written, perhaps ever, in the history of Jewish thought. It's full of revelation and lofty ideas. And we're talking about a world which understands Lomdus and Halacha. And it can understand Kabbala written in the classic language of Kabbala, and it will live even with philosophy if it has to. But this is just flow of consciousness, and it's poetry, and they write about it, and they say it's like ramblings, and it's like dream talk, and it's fantasies, and we just don't know what this person wants. And out of that, he's drawing practical implications, and we'll try this year to talk about these practical implications, because what he's saying is, I'm out of the sort of philosophy of what I'm understanding from my view of spirit. He lives in a spiritually infused universe in which everything is radiating divinity, and that's what really lies behind his philosophy. When Rav Kook is embracing Zionism, when he's embracing the secular, when he's wishing the early football teams success in their football matches, even though they're playing on Shabbat, and his peers are looking at him and saying, "You're crazy. What on earth are you doing here?" He's just living in this world where he sees everything radiating divinity and goodness, and you can see how those who oppose him are profoundly disturbed by this, because you're sort of preaching stuff which has practical implications in how we're we're dealing with irreligious people who are creating a Chilul Hashem in Eretz Yisrael. They're setting up a new Yishuv and they're playing football matches on Shabbos. Like, what could be worse than that? And even his supporters struggle to understand: is this real, or is this mystic who just walks around and just wants to love everyone and see ruchnius and spirituality in everyone, and they don't quite know what to make of it. Rav Kook stands there at the opening of the Hebrew University in Yerushalayim, and he says, "Ki mitzion Torah Hashem Yerushalayim." Like, this is the return of high-level academic studies to Israel and to Eretz Israel, to Tzion. What a tremendous bracha this is! And then he begins speaking about how Chol is the handmaid, the shifcha of religious knowledge, and only when we have Chol and understanding of secular studies can we really be integrated spiritual beings. And he offends everyone by saying this. The Frum don't understand that you're setting up an overtly secularist university in Yerushalayim, and you're quoting the pasuk of Ki mitzion Torah. What can be more sacrilegious than that? And the academics are bothered by this sort of message of what you're doing is also good, because it helps create a holistic Frum person. But that's not what they're interested in. They believe in academia as its own pursuit. So Rav Kook is trying to walk this very, very, very complex path with balancing so much. And he's got a few close Talmidim who really immerse themselves in his way of thought. He's writing prolifically, and as I said, his stuff is still being published now. His writings are still being published now. There's just his output is voluminous, and it's a flow of consciousness, and it's just this overwhelming sense of the divine and Hashem and everything else. But it's difficult to understand, and the messaging he's giving is complicated. Okay, we've spoken about September 1919. He falls out with Mizrahi because he opposes women's suffrage. At the same year, he gets criticized by the secular left for being too close to the Old Yishuv. He gets criticized by Jabotinsky students who are forming the secular right for being too left-wing and too moderate. So everyone's attacking him. He accepts the position as the chief rabbi of Yerushalayim to the opposition of Old Yishuv, who don't accept him and set up their parallel rabbinate. And people don't realize this, but the Eidah Charedis is really its origins. The head of the Eidah Charedis to this day assumes the title of chief rabbi of Yerushalayim. So he's not just the head of the Eidah Charedis that many of us are familiar with as a hechsher. It's a superb hechsher, but it really represents a whole community structure. It's a community structure that allies basically the whole Old Yishuv. So it has everyone from Hungarians to Hasidim to Litvaks to parts of Satmar to parts of Brisk. The whole sort of worlds of the Old Yishuv are loosely under Eidah Charedis. It has a hechsher, but it has a beis din. It has a whole structure, and the head of the beis din is also, in some respects, the chief rabbi of Yerushalayim, or sometimes referred to as Morad Yisrael. He's the chief rabbi of Israel. So it's a parallel rabbinical independent ultra system. The British mandate in February 1921, so 2 years after his return, set up a chief rabbinate of Israel. They know the concept of chief rabbi from the UK, and therefore they want there to be a chief rabbi in Eretz Israel. And Rav Kook is unanimously chosen for that. Unanimously, as a meaning by anyone from who's willing to engage with the concept of chief rabbi in mandate Palestine. So it excludes the Eidah Charedis, it excludes the secular right, it excludes the secular left. So by definition, it's sort of a self-fulfilling sort of group. But it does reflect, and sort of joking aside, it does reflect that when I talk about him as upsetting everyone, I mean institutionally he has no success, but he's recognized by Rabbanim who are minded to sort of try and build a relationship between the values of Torah and the New Yishuv. They do recognize him, and he's chosen as that. He begins setting up his yeshiva, Talmidim, famous Talmidim, the Chalap dynasty, the Nozir, who maybe we'll look at as a separate interesting figure in due time. His son, who we were talking about before, and many others. So he's got his Talmidim, and he's sort of successful in that sense. We spoke about the opening of the Hebrew University in 1925. We spoke about the Arab uprising in Hebron in 1929. So let's just move on from that. In 1931, you've got the Zionist Congress. He writes a letter of support to them, but encourages them to support Shmira Shabbos, that they should be Shomer Shabbos. And again, he upsets everyone. The Old Yishuv says, why are you engaging with these people who are not God-fearing? They're God deniers. And the large parts of the Zionist organization don't like this rabbi who's interfering with them. There's attacks on him. You can still see the forum of attack to this day, by the way, when you go to the Old Yishuv areas in Eretz. So the Pashkaville method of communication, you're aware of this, like signs put on the wall. Back in the day, it's not just the everyone's doing this. So the secularists are using, that's the only way to communicate in a world free internet, free television, without control of radio stations. How do you communicate if you want to send propaganda around? You stick signs up on the wall. So everyone's doing this. Increasingly, the Zionist groups who are increasingly antagonistic to the British are sticking up signs on the walls anti-British, and they're getting arrested for doing so. And the Old Yishuv is putting up signs against Rav Kook for doing that. I suppose the final very significant act of his career is the Arlosoroff story. Did I mention that last week? The Arlosoroff 2 weeks ago. Did I mention this? Okay, so it's a very sad story. Chaim Arlosoroff, we're talking here 1933. Chaim Arlosoroff, who is an intellectual, head of the Jewish Agency, young man, left wing, is assassinated along with his wife when he's walking along the Tel Aviv beach, and this is assumed to be this is blamed on the Jabotinsky's revisionist chevra. This is assumed to be an internal inter-Zionist struggle. Again, without digging up the whole story, but there's significant ruptures now developing. I mentioned that sadly, after the Ottoman occupation ended and British took over, Jews begin fighting amongst themselves, which is not an unfamiliar phenomenon, that sometimes what unites us is only when there's external pressure. And within Orthodoxy, there's a split between different movements about how to deal with this rising new Yishuv. And within the Zionist movement, there's considerable tension between the left-wing Zionist movement and the right-wing Zionist movement. Jabotinsky's revisionists think that we should be more hardline against the British, and these ruptures are developing. Either way, Chaim Arlosoroff is assassinated, and to this day, it remains controversial what was behind this assassination. And it's sometimes even referred to in modern-day Israeli politics. So basically, I'll just summarize the story very, very briefly. Initially, a number of members of Jabotinsky's revisionist group are arrested by the British. After about 2 years, the British deem them innocent, and an Arab is arrested instead, and he is sentenced for the assassination of Arlosoroff. The Jabotinsky, and in a horrible sense, the rise of the left in Israel all the way through to Begin really dates from this time. So in a Zionist movement in which the right and left are evenly split, suddenly support for Jabotinsky plummets and never really gets above, I don't know, 10-15%, all the way through to Begin.
When Begin becomes prime minister in his first month, he sets up a national investigation of Arlosoroff, and it's many years that they can't find him.
So this is a running saw. In other words, the left, Labour, and Ben Gurion's what becomes Labour, throws at the right the Arlosoroff claim. It definitely was a PR disaster for the right, but to this day we don't really know. Was it really an action of Jabotinsky? Was it Arab? We don't really know. Okay, Rav Kook comes to the defence of the supposed Jabotinsky assassins, or at least some of them, not because of necessarily any ideological reasons, but because he genuinely believes they're innocent. He's friendly with the families of some of them, and there's an alibi. I don't want to go through the whole controversial case, but it's possible that one of the accused has an alibi and evidence about it. Either way, he writes a letter of defense, and now he's loathed by the left because they see him as complicit in justifying a murder. Perhaps the closest in our memory of this was, of course, the tragic assassination of Rabin and all the conspiracy theories that developed around that and everything else. So, is this sort of story that's occurring and wreaking havoc on everything? And with that, this is 1934. 1935, Rav Kook passes away at 70. So this is his very complex legacy. And again, I want to emphasize that in many respects, Rav Kook doesn't fit any neat categories. He dresses and looks like a member of the Old Yishuv to his dying day. In many ways, culturally, he's part of the Old Yishuv. These are his friends, right? He's grown up as a Yiddish-speaking Volozhiner Talmid who's a Talmud Chacham. That's where would he be more comfortable socializing, right? With his Old Yishuv friends. He's friendly with the Gedolim of the Old Yishuv. They're his peers. And they themselves, as I said, don't quite know what to make of him. The Old Yishuv, by the way, this is really important to emphasize, then and to this day has lots of views. The idea that there's something called Meir Sha'arim Jury or the Eidah Charedis representing a unified voice is simply not the case. At that point in time, Agudas Yisrael is still a member of the Eidah Charedis. After the state is founded in 48, there's a split within the Eidah Charedis, and some of the opponents of Zionism say, okay, but now it's the government. We're going to work within the structure of the government, albeit very suspiciously, and that leads to the Agudah branch of the Haredi world. And some parts of that world stay part of the Eidah Charedis and refuse to engage at all. And within it, you have the far right, who are Notori Carter, and even those further to the right of Notori Carter, who were expelled from the Eidah Charedis in the 80s, so they're now out of Eidah Charedis on the right. As I said, Agudas Yisrael left the Eidah Charedis on the left because it was too complicit with it. And there's very complicated sort of schools of thought within this, including about how to relate to Rav Kook. So our topic today is not the Eidah Charedis, but I hope that gives you some sort of sense of the complication of the path that he's trying to navigate. I'll pause it just for a minute in case there's any questions, and then I'd like to start sort of just talking a bit about his actual philosophy, which we've alluded to but haven't explored in depth. So yes. So there's no doubt that in many respects he is the founder, all said and done, of religious Zionism. And for us, as we discussed Zionism here as a series a while back, but for us as Orthodox Jews to be able to say that we see that that Israel isn't just a pragmatic state. Again, I want to revisit the whole of the series on Zionism. I just want to say the following: there were a number of stances one could take towards Zionism from a religious point of view. In many respects, the most obvious path to have taken could have been it's an a-religious event. It's got no religious significance either way. It's just Jews trying to avoid being killed in the diaspora. And if it proves a viable model of giving safety to Jews, then why not? That's a theory of political way of dealing with life and surviving. It's not. Again, I've used this example before. If I say, what's the religious approach about quantitative easing, or what's what's the religious view? What's my Das Torah view about whether inflation, by the end of this secular year will be below 2% or not? That's not a Torah question. That's a question for economists. So you could have heard a view that the founding of the State of Israel was a question for socio-political experts, whether it will or won't save Jewish lives and be an effective way of sorting out Jewish life. In many ways, it's a chiddush that it ended up becoming such a religious discussion. I don't mean that completely seriously, because obviously when you're founding a Jewish state, it's going. But one could have adopted such a stance. There were many leaders who took that approach, many Gedolim who took that approach. Then there were Gedolim who took an approach that this is fiercely anti-religious. This is not a Jewish value. This is a rebellion against the states. This is trying to preempt the return, the coming of Moshiach, and this isn't something one should do. And then there were several figures, not just Rav Kook, Rav Reinus, and many others, but Rav Kook was certainly the greatest amongst them, who said, no, this is exciting. Has religious values. For the first time, Judaism is all, and this is agreed upon by everyone. Judaism is meant to be a personal expression of spirituality. It's meant to be communal. We know that. We have a tzibur, we have community, but it's also meant to be national. There's something called a Jewish state that's meant to represent Jewish values. So that sort of confident voice that we can return to Zion and we can set up a state that fundamentally expresses Jewish values and can embody them is a very, very important point that Rav Kook says. Then there's a mindset that because there's another complication here. Even if you're minded to be sympathetic to the state, but the fact is it's being led by youth largely, many of whom are revolutionary spirited. And by definition, when you're revolutionary spirited, you throw everything old out. You throw the baby out with the bathwater, you throw everything old out, and that means throwing out religious values. Many of these people are profoundly secular, vehemently secular. I don't mean secular like we have in modern Israel, where almost no one is really secular, right? I mean this sort of very profound antagonism towards everything that's old, and the whole pressure. I believe you couldn't become a member of a member of the government, a minister in the government in back in the day if one wouldn't change one's surname, right? The whole Hebraization of surnames, with throwing out the whole of Galut, the whole Galuti mentality, the language of Yiddish, the surnames of Yiddish, and with that the whole Old Yishuv mindset and everything else. And suddenly there's a Rav who comes along, who is charismatic, by the way. I should mention that he's enormously charismatic. People warm on a personal level. People warm to his warmth and his love and his incredible spirituality. We're talking about a Godel here, who's a tower of spirituality. He's institutionally a failure, but on a personal level, he's an incredible success. And I mentioned last week, I think I mentioned this last week. He goes around the New Yishuvim, and he says, Rabbi, he does a kumsitz by the fire, and he goes on horseback. He dances around on horseback with and they've never met anyone who takes them on their values and says, I want you to grow because I want everyone to grow, but you're wonderful, precious people. So he starts this engagement with the New Yishuv. And I want also that we should realize, because this is so profoundly important, and I'm not here taking sides in any debate, but can you imagine Israel if it wouldn't have had Rabbonim, Talmidei Chachamim, who were willing to step forward and create a Rabbanut, create a system of courts, create kashrut in every town and city, to have a Rabbanut Tzava'it where there's kashrut in the army, where every unit has embedded into it Rabbonim who are willing to engage with these she'elot, where there's branches of the government where SOFA can. I mean, we see this now. Please go on our trip to forthcoming, quick plug, forthcoming solidarity trip to Israel, which please everyone should sign up to. Maybe I'll do a quick plug at the end of this also on that. But where you can go into an army base and you can see a SOFA sitting over a Sefer Torah, correcting it, who's a soldier in the army and being employed by the army to do that. Can we imagine where Israel would be without that? And at the end of the day, that is Rav Kook's incredible legacy. So. It's complicated. These things are complicated, and those who opposed him were great people. I don't want to, in this particular form, get caught up in what the counter argument should be. We're trying to understand Rav Kook, but can one imagine Israel without that, without the whole structure? I mean, it's frightening to think about. It's genuinely frightening to think about. So Rav Kook wasn't just a sort of theoretician about that, but he was a leader in that. That's legacy number one. Legacy number two is he is one of the founding fathers of modern Orthodoxy. There's probably three figures who. Sorry, can you just pass me tissues? There's probably three figures who. There are many figures, but three figures who systematically expressed the idea that modernity is not just something to be opposed as a threat. That's a tenable position number one. It's not something just to be accommodated reluctantly, like, okay, it's there and we can use it. No one opposes modernity in having electric light bulbs lighting up their shul instead of a candle. So it's something just to be accommodated. And then there's a third perspective, which is actually has insight to offer. There's aspects of modernity which are great, which are positive, which teach us things about the world that we never knew, that can enhance our avodas Hashem, that can make us better people, that can enrich us as people. That there can be a real working together between these two forces. And there were three figures who of world-class status who said this: the great Rav Soloveitchik in America, Rav Hirsch in Germany, and Rav Kook. They didn't all live at the same time, and I'm not trying to put them together. And there were differences between their philosophy. But there's a commonality between all three in their willingness to say that. And again, that's Rav Kook's second great legacy, a founder of one of the founding fathers of modern Orthodoxy. I will try and explore briefly some of the differences between what we would nowadays call modern Orthodoxy and what perhaps religious Zionism has become, but that's secondly a great legacy. The third great legacy was Torah. At the end of the day, as much as his Torah arguments are hard to understand and different to perhaps anything else that anyone had written, there's a whole Olam yeshivas, there's a whole yeshiva world that learn his Torah, that are inspired by his Torah, and it introduced a whole new genre of Torah. And as I said, his own work is prolific, but his Talmidim have carried on, and there's an enormous tzibur of B'nai Torah You go to Merkaz Arav and Har Hamor and so many other yeshivas packed with, on Simchas Torah, packed with hundreds of young men dancing around the Sifrei Torah. There's a whole Torah world that he created, in many ways single-handedly, out of that. And don't forget, modern Orthodoxy always has a double-edged sword. It's a philosophical message, but it's also in a way a kiruv tool, because those who are drawn to modernity, if no one can, we'll hear more about this later when we speak about Rav Kook's thinking. But people who aren't trained Talmidei Chachamim, who aren't trained philosophers, doesn't mean they don't have thoughts about life. And if they have an intuition that there's something positive in modernity, they're not going to go after, or many of them won't go after a voice that's only willing to say modernity traits terrible, to be avoided, or of no spiritual relevance, because people have an intuition that there's something of value there. And so there's a kiruv element in this, in that a whole sibur of traditional Jews and Orthodox Jews, perhaps unlearned in a very profound way, would have simply left Judaism had there not been that. And out of them has carved Rav Kook a flourishing world of Torah. So thank you for giving me that question, because maybe I should have emphasized this more. And we're going to look at all of this in more detail. His legacy is vast, but measured as a classic Godol besides anything else. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, Jonathan. Yes, I should have said, I believe the number is several tens of thousands. In my notes, I've got a note about this. I didn't write this down on my paper. I didn't write this down on my paper. I probably should have. And he's buried on Har HaZeisim, and he's very popular. He's very loved. So by the standards of the population, then tens of thousands is a vast number. And many of his opponents come out also to his levaya. So his legacy sort of lives on. The old Yishuv, in many ways, they're still traumatized by him. They didn't know what to make of this world-class Talmid Chacham who's part of their ranks. He's very, very much a member of their world. You can't. Again, he's a Volozhiner. He's a Gan in Torah. He's someone whom they themselves turned to for Haskomas, for their Sephorim, and then he's betrayed them in this way that they can't understand. In which he's, as I said, riding on horseback and singing around bonfires with Zionist youth and writing Hatzlacha Rabbah messages to Hapoel football teams, and it was a trauma really for that whole world, and to this day it remains a bit of a living, an open sore. Sorry. Yeah, sorry. Yeah. Okay, so Rav Kook does travel to America. I didn't discuss this because I don't want to go too much. He meets President Coolidge. Coolidge, is that name? Coolidge. What's his first name? Calvin Coolidge. Sorry, yeah. Very quiet man. Silent Cal. Okay, Calvin Coolidge, and he does travel across America. He meets Jews there. I think it is fair to say that I believe in his lifetime. Really his and to this day, to a degree, most of the serious engagement with his work takes place in Eretz Israel. His impact on Tzotzaris is less. Though all of us are impacted to some degree. Like he's a living name in our lives and our world. But I think very few chutzniks have invested enough time in including myself 100%. I've invested enough time in really understanding, and that's one of the reasons why I chose him as my first great thinker to speak about, because he's so impactful, yet we really don't know that much about what he really said. And it's sadly, I think most people, if you said to Rav Kook, they'd probably say religious Zionist rabbi, founder of first religious Zionist rabbi, which is not accurate. He wasn't the first religious Zionist rabbi, but certainly the most prominent one. But there's so much else to him that's fascinating. Yeah.
Open-mindedness to both like the religious and the secular. Is that something to be like criticized as a leader, to kind of take such a middle, like meaning you're a leader and you have values and it's just not possible to please everyone. So not everyone is going to fit in line. Okay, so very important question, and I'll just say it for the sake of those online in the recording. Is his open-mindedness to religious and secular to be criticized, because you're just going to not end up pleasing everyone? Yes. Okay, so in this series, and actually, to be honest, in life, I never ever criticize great thinkers like that. I'm willing to discuss the pros and cons of their viewpoint. I don't feel that my own personal view on the matter, in many cases, I don't have a personal view on the matter. And even if I do, I don't feel it particularly weighs the thing. I spend a lot of time talking about Kabbala and philosophy and so on, and people sometimes say, well, what do you, I don't really see in a machlokas in the Rambam and Arizal that Zobin's
if you have that reason, plus open, or I'm not open, like particularly is of relevance to this. But it's a fair question, and the answer is we don't know. It's a good question. Rav Kook's view was twofold. First of all, I don't know, maybe I'm wrong in this, but I think he didn't necessarily think about your question in those terms. Is it dangerous to do so? Is it practically speaking good or bad? I don't think he was someone who he was a top-down person, not a bottom-up. He was living in a world of spirituality, and he lives in it with a consciousness in which spirituality streams down, and we have to work with that spirituality, and then the results will inevitably play out in their own ways. And this is a very Jewish way of thinking, by the way. Right? Really, in halacha, we often don't ask the question, what will be the practical, political results of this? Halacha is halacha, we have to do the right thing, right? In non-Chabad Orthodoxy, we don't speak about what actions can bring Mashiach. We say, keep halacha, and that will spiritualize the world, and then everything else will sort itself out. So Rav Kook very, very much lived with that mindset. So, and in some ways you could argue his view has been proven right? He was a failure in a sense institutionally in his life, and yet look what he built just through who he was. So I don't know if he would have thought through the question in your way and said, practically speaking, am I trying to please everyone? Is it possibly to be successful? Is there not a danger in creating an accommodation between the from and the non-from, and what could be the impact of that? I think he just did what he thought was right, and he lived in a I can't emphasize enough, he was a tzaddik. He lived in a spiritually infused world where everything clothes with spirituality, and I don't think he was capable of seeing this young. I think when he went around, we spoke about this last week, this tour of the kibbutzim and mashavim with Yosef Chaim Sonnenfeld. I think when one observer would have seen a secular, atheistic, anti-rabbi youth, the other one just saw the neshama shining out so brightly that he didn't notice anything else. And it's a beautiful, precious person who's come to Eretz Yisrael to farm Eretz Yisrael and to build a Jewish Yishuv. And that was it. I don't think he thought more about it than that. That's number one. Number two, there's been a long-running debate in the Orthodox world about the balance to be found between building walls and openness to outside influence. And what I would say is that anyone who defines themselves as Orthodox agrees on the principles. The question is, how do you balance those principles? Anyone who is Orthodox has to accept that there's some boundaries. We build some walls. That's what it means to be Orthodox. There's things you can't do, things you can do. There's walls there. Anyone who's Orthodox also subscribes to the idea that we have to engage with the world. When we're not a monastic faith So now the question is, what's the balance? How do you balance the two? How much energy do you, how high are these walls? How thick are these walls? How much energy do you put into them? How it's built into the fabric of halacha. There's some boundaries, right? There's halachas which are explicitly there to create boundaries. Aspects of stam yenom and bishlachim, all sorts of areas of kashrus. Many of the Rishonim give the reasons for some of the laws of kashrus to create raise consciousness when you're socializing and the like. So some boundaries are built into halacha. There's no doubt. How high are the boundaries? What's the balance between the boundaries? Is always going to be a debate. Pro of creating high boundaries, you sort of self in you're safe in your enclave. Danger of removing these boundaries, you become vulnerable to outside influence. Danger in building these boundaries, you invest ever-increasing energy in building walls, and you don't have enough energy for yourself. You lose all the positive of engagement with modernity. You leave stranded those who are outside your boundaries, who are left vulnerable. So what I will say, my personal take on this is that I think, in my view, this is the one bit I will say in my view, that I think in hindsight, both communities within the Orthodox world were necessary in modern day Israel. I think that had there not been a Dartinuri world, as I said, who built the institutions of state and the like, I think it's impossible to imagine what Israel could have been. But I do think that had there not been a group that chose to remain with a sort of pure Torah cut off, I think Israel would have struggled also. And thoughtful thinkers in the Dartinuri world explicitly acknowledge this, that the Rav Lichtensteins of the world, Rav Neria, and the like. When I arrived in Israel in 1991, I grew up here I grew up in London. In those days, I don't remember ever hearing the term in my childhood, Haredi Modern Orthodox. It was simply not a term that I remember ever hearing. I was completely oblivious to any of the big conversations going on in the Jewish world in that way. I got very proud of my Hershey heritage, but I didn't really know figure of Rav Soloveitchik. Didn't know much about Rav Kook. I'd heard of him, but didn't know much about him. And I arrived in Eretz fascinated to discover this whole new world. The very first article I read from Rav Neria was on this very point in which he recognised there was a need for. Now, what I hope is that some of these divisions can be healed, and actually both groups can work together and recognise there's a truth in both approaches, and the like. But I do think history has shown that in hindsight, probably the From world would have struggled had it not had some degree of both. But it's a pity when that ends up as antagonistic and can go too far either way. I will speak later in the series about some more about some of the dangers of Rav Kook's approach also, and some of the modern aspects of sort of the modern variants of his ideology, and where that can drift towards. Sorry, yes.
I think that
I'm leapfrogged you accidentally, but yeah, go for it, Avram. Yeah.
To a large extent, I think Israel today, his impact is felt through his son Rav Yehuda, who was a rabbi, a very big rabbi in the 60s, so in the 6-day war.
Yes.
His Talmidim, Hanan Porat, and the whole level there went out and set up all these yeshivas. So the Gush Emunim was directly from Rav Yehuda. So his power today, his son, to their Talmidim, created, I think, right-wing. I think that's its impact today in real life.
So I'm going to 2 points. Again, just for the recording, Avram is arguing that the chief impact of Rav Kook was through Rav Yehuda, which led to Chadalim. That's his real impact today. I will get to that, and I will get to Gush Emunim. And as someone who really, I can't emphasize enough, knows so little about these things, I will share my personal view, which is that Rav Yehuda did not represent the only interpretation of Rav Kook, and there were other ways of understanding Rav Kook, and that Gush Emunim is not the only outcome of Rav Kook. And I will also argue that I think the whole of the Dati world are still in many ways the Talmidim of Rav Kook, even though the ones that are most blatant about that sort of loyalty to him. But I will define all those terms later. We'll get there. I agree. I agree partially with your comments, but not completely. Yeah.
I wasn't here last week, so I don't
yes.
know if you brought up. There was
no, 2 weeks ago, yes.
I missed it last week. The in this matter between religiousness and secularism,
yes,
because within many of the Orthodox schools today, there's a fear of art. I don't know if you dealt with, whilst Rav Kook was here in London, his great spirituality and his love of art.
Okay, I mentioned it briefly. I mentioned his visits to the National Art Gallery and the like. I hadn't planned to deal with it as a part of his philosophy, but I've just made a note now, and I will add it in. When we look at his philosophy, I'll speak about his views around art. It's a fair point. And you are correct that in parts of the modern Orthodox world, particularly Rav Soloveitchik's version of modern Orthodoxy, there's an openness to science and philosophy, but more closeness to the arts. And we'll discuss some of that. I'm happy to discuss some of that, which Rav Kook was open to. Yeah, last comment, then we will we'll stop for today. Yeah. Yes, it's a fair point, and I will mention that next week. Yes, just to summarize again for the recording, for those live, the Rav Kook saw the antagonism towards religion as itself a religious seeking. He saw the youthful revolutionary spirit as representing a genuine searching, and he was excited by that. He fed off the energy of that and saw that as good. I would say, though, it was hard to think of any behavior that one could do that Rav Kook wouldn't see as spiritual. That was the sort of person he was, right? And you can see that the danger also, for those who are philosophically minded, we'll get to this next week, antinomianism. Is this going to lead to a rejection of the whole system of halacha? The answer is chas v'shalom. Rav Kook was not doing that, but his opponents feared that it would lead to a wholesale rejection of halacha, because if everything is ruchnius, then do what you want. But we'll look at that in Hashem next week. So we'll stop here for today, and thank you so much for joining me. Hashem next week we'll carry on.
Thank you.